In this video, we'll be exploring mysteries that range from the very strange and highly suspicious disappearances of these two young men last seen getting into this policeman's car, to the disappearance and very likely murder of this young lady in London, to the case of this young girl kidnapped in Germany and then offered back to her parents for a ransom. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is strawberry kefir, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries Iceberg. Southern Narwhal. So narwhals are this awesome creature, the unicorns of the sea as some people call them. And fun fact, this horn that comes out of the narwhal isn't actually a horn, it is a tooth. And they are one tooth that grows super long. It just keeps growing. It's kind of spike shape, and it actually grows out of the narwhal's gum and kind of looks like a horn. And this tooth is kind of like a sensor to the narwhal. You know, it detects water temperature, it detects saltiness, and it is used kind of like a probe in the water to help these narwhals better understand where they are, their surroundings, etc. So yeah, super cool. But narwhals are typically native to the Arctic, and not really anywhere else. But this entry is regarding what has been dubbed the Southern Narwhal, which are the supposed narwhal sightings that have been seen kind of in the Antarctic as opposed to the Arctic. So like the complete opposite side of the planet. These sightings go back as far as like the 1600s, with various sailors, captains, explorers, all seeing what they described as, you know, a horned aquatic animal, which upon closer inspection seemed to be a narwhal. And I mean, these could have been mistaken identities, they could have been regular whales that people had mistaken for narwhals, or they could have just been some other type of sea creature, or perhaps a previously thought extinct animal, like the Adobenacetops, which likely died out like 5 million years ago, but it looks pretty gnarly. Or they could have actually been a type of narwhal living in the Antarctic space that we have just yet to discover. Strangelets are something we covered before in the space iceberg, but just the concept of them is absolutely insane. And I won't get super into them and the details of them, because as I said, the whole concept is very advanced, and it kind of hurts my head just thinking about it. And I will simplify some things, but the gist will still be there. But basically all of matter, so this mug, for example, they are made up of these tiny little things, you know, atoms, and within the atoms are even smaller things called protons and neutrons. And if you go even further than that, the protons and neutrons are made up of these tiny particles called quarks, and quarks tend to be quite strongly bound to each other. You know, if there's 3 quarks in a bundle, they just stick together really hard. It's kind of hard for them to, you know, break off and react. And actually, the stronger you pull against them, trying to pull them apart, the more energy they exert in holding themselves together. And there are a few different types of quarks, which we won't really get into them, but they all have slightly different properties and slightly different levels of stabilization. So for example, the up and down type of quark, they're normally the most stable quark. And the other ones, they tend to be quite unstable, which means if and when they exist, they don't tend to last in that form for very long. And I hope this is not too complex right off the bat. But this entry is regarding something called a strange quark, which normally strange quarks are quite unstable, so they can't really exist for very long in any substantial way, unless they're in this hypothetical situation. And the situation is inside something called a quark star, which again I covered in the space iceberg, but this is basically a version of a neutron star. So if you could imagine in a really big, really low pressure star, it would, you know, maybe suck in all of this stuff, rocks and material, but then as the star gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the pressure inside gets more and more intense, these physical things like metals and rocks would eventually break apart into, you know, individual atoms, and then eventually when the pressure got so intense, the bonds of the atoms themselves would, you know, break apart and become individual neutrons. And that is where we get the name neutron star from. But as we mentioned earlier, these neutrons are in turn made up of smaller particles called quarks. And the idea is that a quark star would be a type of neutron star that's even smaller and more compact. And the pressure would actually break apart these neutrons into their individual quarks. And so on the inside of one of these stars, it would basically just be a sea of quarks, with the pressure being too intense for atoms or even neutrons to form. And now that we've got that science lesson out of the way, it is theorized that in these conditions, perhaps strange quarks would be able to survive, they'd be able to thrive, and kind of stay in a steady form. And what's interesting about strange quarks is that they are kind of the most strong quark, or the most attractive quark in a way, where they are actually able to convert other quarks into themselves. So if you imagine this sea of quarks within this star, a few of the quarks turn to strange quarks, they convince other quarks around them to become strange quarks as well, and then eventually, slowly, the entire interior of this star is just filled with strange quarks. And this is what is referred to as strange matter. Now, as I said, quark stars are somewhat hypothetical, and the idea of the interior of one of these quark stars being fully strange quarks is also somewhat hypothetical, and mostly theoretical, as we can't really take one of these stars and, crack them open, take a look inside. But the idea is that if you take these quark stars and maybe you have a collision with another quark star, they smash into each other, and then little bits of this strange matter fly off into the universe, and these little bits would be called strangelets, because, strange quarks. But it is theorized that these little strangelets could become highly contagious. So, these tiny particles, they go flying through space, they hit into a planet, maybe Mars or something like that, and then a chain reaction would start to take place, where all of the atoms, all of the particles that make up Mars would slowly start to get converted into strange matter, until eventually the entirety of Mars is just made up of strange matter. And this would spread like a disease throughout the universe, like an ooze or something, slowly converting all matter in the universe into strange matter. So yeah, I don't mean to scare you, any more than is necessary, of course. And sorry if this entry was a little bit mind-boggling. It's a very complex topic, and I'm not the best at explaining these sorts of things. But as I said, a lot of it is theoretical. We're not even fully sure if quark stars do exist. So you can probably rest easy for tonight. But yeah, what a strange entry. Supertasks. So the idea of supertasks is very mind-boggling, honestly, but I'll try and explain them briefly without anyone's heads blowing up. And Vsauce has a fantastic video on this if you want to check it out down below. I'll put a little link down there. But for this entry, imagine you had a cake. And for this example, this cake looks exactly like a candle, but this cake would have a certain volume of cake, so how much cake is in the cake, and it would also have a certain height. Now let's say you cut this cake in half and then stacked the cake on top of the other half. The volume of the cake wouldn't change, you haven't taken away or added any cake, but the height of the cake will have doubled. So pretty simple so far. And then say you do that again, you take the top layer, you cut it in half, you stack it on top of the cake, and you keep doing this over and over again. You keep cutting the top layer, stacking it up, cutting the top layer, stacking it up, and you do this hypothetically an infinite amount of times. At the end of this, you will have an infinitely high cake, but its mass will be finite. The mass will be whatever mass you started with in the original cake. You could hypothetically eat this cake within just a few minutes because the mass of it will be finite, and yet, in theory, you could stretch this cake from one side of the universe to the other, as it would have infinite height. And this would be called a super solid, so a finite mass or volume with infinite properties, be that height, width, depth, length, etc. And supertasks are basically this, but for actions instead of objects. So say you have a jar or an infinitely large cup, and you start throwing in jelly beans one by one. By the time you've thrown in an infinite amount of jelly beans, there will have passed an infinite amount of time. So that's pretty straightforward. But what if you threw in one jelly bean, and then you waited 1 minute, and then you threw in another jelly bean, and then waited only 30 seconds, and then threw in another, waited 15 seconds, threw in another, waited 7.5 seconds, and you kept halving the amount of time waited? The total time in this sequence would never exceed 2 minutes. But in the end, you will have thrown in an infinite amount of jelly beans, or completed an infinite amount of tasks in just 2 minutes, or a finite amount of time. Now, this topic can get very complex and quite interesting. If you, for instance, as you're throwing the jelly beans in, if you alternate between red jelly jelly bean and blue jelly bean, then at the end of this infinite sequence, what will have been the last jelly bean you threw in? Would it be a blue jelly bean or a red one? I mean, it kind of has to be one color, right? Because you've only been throwing in red and blue beans, and assumedly you have stopped because the 2 minutes is up, but how can there be a last action or a last digit in an infinite sequence? If there was a last, number or digit in the sequence, then it would imply that the sequence is countable, and this would mean it wouldn't be infinity. So very fun concept, very interesting idea. If you want to go a bit deeper into these concepts, into this theory, into some of these ideas and problems, as I said, absolutely check out the Vsauce video on this. And I absolutely love this stuff, but as I said, it can get quite a bit complicated sometimes. So yeah, as I said, fantastic entry, but we'll leave it there for now. Suzy Lamplugh was an estate agent who went missing in Fulham, London in 1986 while attending a house viewing. So on the day of her disappearance, Suzy had penciled into her diary, or her work schedule, that she was to meet a man named Mr. Kipper outside of a house that he was looking to buy, number 37 Shorrolds Road in Fulham. There were multiple eyewitnesses on the day that put her outside of the house waiting for this man, and then the eyewitnesses say she basically wasn't around, and then she was seen leaving the house with a man. So it was assumed that she had went there, waited for the man had arrived, they both went in together, looked around, did the house viewing, and then left the house. And the eyewitnesses of this man were somewhat strange. He was a white man with dark hair, with a dark, pretty smart suit, and he was carrying a bottle of champagne wrapped in like a cute little ribbon. And then the eyewitnesses said they saw the pair fighting. They were having a little bit of a row. They both got into Suzy's car, and then she drove away quite erratically, and they had seemingly carried this fight with them while they were in the car. And then this is where the sightings of the pair start to get a little strange. So they were seen, first of all, driving away from the house, together in Suzy's car. And then there were other sightings of Suzy quite hastily driving and parking up outside this other house, which was another house for sale on Stevenage Road. And then there were sightings of Suzy in the passenger seat in a black BMW. And she was apparently screaming quite frantically, hitting the horn, and I guess no one alerted any police or came to her rescue or anything. But this was also around Stevenage Road, and this black BMW was also seen parked up around the initial house viewing on Shorrolds Road. And after Suzy didn't return to work that afternoon, her colleagues did report her missing to the police, and when police went round to the flat, the one that she was viewing with the man, they couldn't find much besides eyewitnesses. So they went round to Stevenage Road, where the other house was, and they found there her car abandoned, and it was seemingly hastily abandoned. The driver's side door was open, the handbrake wasn't engaged, the key was missing from the car, and it looked like the car driver's seat had been kind of adjusted for someone that wasn't Suzy, and her purse was also found in the car. So very suspicious set of circumstances. It is theorized quite likely that the black BMW belonged to the killer, and as I said, witnesses initially saw Suzy kind of drive off with this man in the car, and they seemed to be having a row, and then Suzy's car was later found outside of this other house. And as I mentioned, it seemed to have been parked up quite hastily. The door was unlocked, the handbrake wasn't on. So what's thought maybe to have happened is she drove away from the house with this man in her car. Maybe the man ended up incapacitating her somehow, and then perhaps he took over the car, adjusted the seat, drove up outside of this house, and then somehow transported her into his car, into the black car, perhaps as she was fighting, as she was struggling. When she was in the car, as I said, she was screaming frantically, she was hitting the car horn, but no rescue ever came. And when this black BMW disappeared from the scene, Suzy was never seen again. Quite quickly in the investigation, they ruled out her boyfriend as a suspect, and they did a search of her flat, a search and investigation and interviews with her work colleagues, and they found that someone had left Suzy a bouquet of roses at her work just a few days ago. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the eyewitnesses said that the man outside of the flat, he had, a bottle of champagne with a nice little bow on it. So the champagne with the, bouquet of roses, it seemed like these were connected, and whoever it was a bit of a, schmoozer. And after doing some further investigations, they stumbled across a man named John Cannon. He was known for being a bit of a schmoozer. He fit the description, he was in the area at the time, and he was a previously convicted assaulter who had, assaulted and beaten his girlfriend just a few years ago because she had tried to leave him, which, yeah, massive red flag. Then he threatened a shopkeeper just a year later and then actually assaulted her. And at the time of the disappearance of Suzy Lamplugh, he was actually on day release and was working as a porter, as I said, around the Fulham area. He was known for his ability to kind of attract and to woo women, and for being quite, a charmer, quite charismatic, quite a romantic kind of guy. And he was known for buying chocolates, roses, drinks, etc. for women that he liked. And he was known for socializing quite a bit, for visiting wine bars in the area, which there was one just across the road from where Suzy worked. And he had apparently told his fellow inmates that he had a, new uptown girlfriend that he called Susu, or, Suzy. And if that wasn't enough evidence, he also owned a black BMW. And when he was questioned about this later, he said that yes, he did own the black BMW, but he had actually bought it from a man who was responsible for the murders of Shirley Banks and Suzy Lamplugh and another girl. And when police said, okay, is that man you? He apparently nodded, but later denied that he had ever done this, fully recanted his entire confession interview. Oh, and Shirley Banks, the woman I just mentioned, she was actually his girlfriend, who John was later convicted of killing and sentenced to life in prison. So yeah, it was absolutely fucking John, with even the police going so far as to say, yes, we believe it was 100% John, but we just don't have the, evidence and resources to convict him. So yeah, I think this happens quite a bit where someone is convicted of another crime. They're convicted of one murder, they're put in prison for life, and so the police don't really put resources or bother, convicting them of anything else, because it's like, what, we're going to waste resources finding evidence, doing interviews, and then setting up a trial, wasting the court's time, all just to put him in prison for a second life sentence. It might make sense to use the resources on actual active criminals, but what likely happened in this case was he was around the area. Maybe he saw her, as he was in the wine bar looking across the road. He saw this pretty lady at the front desk of this estate agent's, and then he slowly started to fall in love with her. He tried to kind of love bomb her, buy her gifts, buy her flowers, and then maybe he made some big proposal to her while she was at the house viewing, come and run away with me sort of thing. And when she denied his advances, he did whatever he did. Kidnapped her, took her away, and very likely ended up killing her. Suzy herself was a young, very smart, attractive lady with a ton of potential, and John took that all away from her and took Suzy away from the rest of the world. Terrance Williams and Felipe Santos. So these were these two men who went missing from Naples, Florida in 2003 and 4 in these very similar, very strange circumstances. And the last time either of these men were seen was when they were on two separate occasions seen getting into the back of this policeman's car. And this was a police deputy named Steve Corkins of the local county sheriff's office. And with Felipe Santos, he stopped Felipe, pulled him over, and then arrested him for driving without a license. And then just a few months later, Terrance was arrested for also driving without a license. And on both occasions, the men were never seen again. Steve's account of what happened was, he said basically that he changed his mind on both occasions. He said, yeah, I went to arrest them, I threw them in the back of the car, and I was going to drive to the police station, but on the way, as I was speaking to these young men, they kind of tugged on my heartstrings. I felt a little sorry for them. They weren't really as bad as they seemed. So he said on both occasions, he was like, alright, as long as you don't do it again, you're kind of free to go. And he said he dropped Santos off at a local convenience store, and then that was it. He never really saw him again. And this was even though Santos was actually on his way to work, and his work wasn't too far from the convenience store. So it seemed strange that he would drop him off at the convenience store. Surely if you had changed your mind and you were going out of your way to help the guy, you might just drive a little bit further and drop him off at work. So very suspicious. And then a few months later, 27-year-old Terrance Williams was driving along, and he was driving under the influence. He didn't have a license. He didn't have a vehicle registration. So all terrible things, granted, but basically from the family's perspective, Terrance went out, he was on his way home, and then he just kind of disappeared. So his family thought this was a bit strange. They went to investigate where Terrance might be, what might have happened to him, and they found that his car had been towed outside of this local cemetery, and the tow report and request was signed by Officer Stephen Corkins. So they called the police station, they requested to speak to Steve Corkins, and they found that, very strangely, he hadn't filed an official arrest, nor did he file an official incident report for whatever happened that morning. And when they spoke to Steve directly, he said that he had no recollection, no memory of anything happening that morning. He was like, towing outside a cemetery? That wasn't me. I have no idea what you're talking about. But upon further investigation, they found these eyewitnesses around the cemetery, and these eyewitnesses were able to place Officer Corkins at the scene. So then the family went back to Corkins, and eventually he was like, yeah, I do remember being there that morning. But he said he basically pulled Terrance over for reckless driving. Terrance said that he was late for work. And then Officer Corkins, you know, the lovable, kind guy he is, he said, all right, you know, I want to arrest you, but if you're late for work, I kind of need to help you out. He said, jump in the back of my car, I'll drive you to this convenience store. And apparently Terrance had told him that he worked in the convenience store. So he went, he dropped Terrance at the convenience store, and then he drove back to the car, checked the license, checked all of that, and only then found that Terrance was driving without a license. And he said he just felt tricked by Terrance, like he was such a nice young man. I really trusted him, and then he, you know, bamboozled me. What a dastardly trick. Which, yeah, absolutely believable. And then Steve said that he later called this convenience store to, you know, check that Terrance got there fine. And the convenience store apparently told him that Terrance didn't work there. They don't know who Terrance is. And so Terrance had fooled this police officer once again. Except there was like zero evidence that Terrance or Corkins had ever gone to the convenience store. There was no eyewitnesses that said that they were there. The camera footage didn't show the cop car or Terrance or Corkins there. Corkins and the convenience store's phone records didn't show a call to the convenience store. And so, as with Santos, the last time that Terrance was ever seen was getting into the back of Corkins' car. And more information started to come out when they did a further deep dive into it. So during his recorded dispatch call to get the car towed, Corkins said that he basically came to the scene, he saw this abandoned car, and then he's on the phone saying, yeah, you know, I just came here, found an abandoned car, it's kind of in the way of traffic, if you can come tow it, that would be fantastic. Which, that's very suspicious. He never mentioned in the call that it was abandoned because he had actually stopped Terrance. He never mentioned Terrance, he never mentioned pulling him over for, you know, reckless driving. And it was found out that Corkins himself had likely moved the car for some reason, and they theorized that when Terrance was pulled over, when he parked up, he was, you know, in a normal parking spot, you know, out of the way of traffic, that didn't really require a towing. And so maybe after this whole ordeal, Corkins got in his car, drove it a little bit into traffic in order to justify the towing. So yeah, this Corkins guy is looking incredibly suspect. And after both disappearances, you know, in the hours following these disappearances, Corkins was apparently missing for around about 2 hours each time. So investigators thought this was a little bit suspicious. They ended up bringing in the FBI, as they normally do with internal investigations like this. And the FBI searched Corkins' home, they searched his car, they had sniffer dogs and all of that, and nothing really turned up. And Corkins was eventually fired from his job, but he was never charged for the disappearances or murders or anything regarding these two men. Now, the main theory is that Corkins, you know, picked them up, ended up killing them for whatever reason, and then disposing of the bodies. Another theory is regarding something called starlighting, which is where if you're in a small town and you see someone who's, you know, unruly, they're a wrong-un coming into your town causing trouble, you don't really arrest them, you don't kill them, you don't do anything, but you simply pick them up, drive way out of town, and then just drop them off there. Basically just kind of getting bad people away from your town, which is a practice that has actually been proven to kind of regularly happen, at least in the past, with policemen, where on a few occasions some American Indians have actually died from this, where, you know, they're picked up, brought way outside of town, and then they're in the middle of a forest or desert or something, you know, in the middle of winter or in the middle of summer, and they just end up dying from exposure. So that's one theory as to what might have happened. But if this were the case, you'd think one of them would turn up somewhere. You'd think either their body would turn up, or they'd get in contact with their family, or something would happen. Or one theory that is kind of pro Corkins is that he did genuinely just drop them off at these, you know, convenience stores, and they just ended up fleeing for whatever whatever reason. You know, maybe they used it as an excuse to escape their family, escape their responsibilities, or they wanted to avoid further problems with the law. You know, if they had arrest warrants or they were doing stuff illegally, they used this as an excuse to jump ship and disappear, which I think that theory is very unlikely, and I think the starlighting one is slightly more likely but still quite unlikely. And I also think Steve Corkins is suspicious as all get out, but he has never been charged for these crimes, and so these are still open cases to this day. The murder of Eva Roy. So this took place in the year 1918, when Eva Roy was just 14 years old, when she was left home alone when her father went into town for work, and when he came back home, she was nowhere to be seen. A search was soon started, and hours later, Eva was found dead, tied to a tree, having seemingly been abused, tortured, and killed. And a lot of the evidence in this case was sadly kind of destroyed at the scene, and this was by, you know, well-meaning neighbors who didn't like seeing Eva in this way. So they said, you know, this is ridiculous. They took her body, they clothed her, they washed her, they cleaned her up. They wanted her to be, you know, somewhat dignified, cleaned up, not half naked tied to a tree. But in doing this, they obviously removed and destroyed a ton of the evidence. They contaminated almost all the evidence on Eva's body. They washed away everything else. They changed her clothes. They were walking around the tree, you know, so the soil and the actual scene was contaminated. And police at the time, while they were investigating, they got these sniffer dogs, and they got the scent, or at least a scent, at the crime scene. And the dogs slowly sniffed their way across this field and came to a man named Lou Hall, who was a neighbor. He was a local laborer, and so police immediately arrested Lou. They tried to charge Lou for the crime twice, but he was acquitted in both trials, and so officially the case of Eva is still to this day unresolved. There are also, as a side mystery, these kind of rumors, these experiences that people have had of Eva haunting the local area, and these sightings of Eva are often seen at night. They're of Eva or a girl kind of draped in black, whispering, you know, "I'm Eva," and asking or begging the people to help her. So as I said, that's a side mystery at least. But as for the original case, the original mystery, this brutal murder and torture of this 14-year-old girl, it was sadly never solved. The worst movie ever's lone visitor. So this is in relation to the worst movie ever, and no, I'm not talking about The Room, which is a great film, or even Birdemic, which is yeah, that's something special altogether, I think. But this was literally the title of this film, the worst movie ever, and it was a purposefully bad film made in 2011, and it also has the record for the worst grossing film of all time, at least in its opening weekend, with a box office performance of, get this, just a single ticket. So in all the theaters they opened at all across America, just a single person bought a ticket. So they grossed a total of $11. And basically, this mystery is we have no idea who that single person is or was. You know, why they chose to see the film on its midnight release. Did they plan to see the film? Was this like in advance? Or did they just stumble across the theater? Maybe they were like a stoned college kid and they just thought, yeah, this is a great laugh. Let me just buy a ticket for this film. It'd honestly be kind of great to, you know, find the person to interview them, ask them a few questions, kind of paint the scene. But yeah, for this one, maybe we'll find out. If we do find out, it might be a little hard to believe them that they were that one person, unless they have like a receipt or a, you know, film ticket or something. But yeah, this kind of makes me want to check out the film, which it honestly sounds pretty bad, which is good. I don't know. Tombs of the Unknown Soldiers. So this is kind of a bittersweet entry, and naturally in wars, as you can imagine, there are a ton of what are called unknown soldiers. So these are soldiers that end up dying, either they're shot or blown up or die in some other way, and for whatever reason they can't be identified. So they are typically dubbed unknown soldiers. In the past, often they had trouble kind of burying them, because do you just do like individual graves for all these unknown people? And who's really gonna visit unknown graves? If you don't know who's down there, you don't know where they're from. Typically people just go to the graves of their own loved ones. And so this was a thing that was kind of mainly started in World War I. Like it became mainstream all over the world after World War I. But before this there was obviously tombs of unknown soldiers. But since World War I, it has kind of become popular all around the world in various countries, where you commemorate all of these unknown soldiers with one big memorial. So the idea for a lot of these is that you take one or many bodies of unknown soldiers, you bury them in this tomb, you have a memorial attached to it, and this is kind of representative of all of the unknown soldiers that die from that country. And obviously we don't know the identities of these unknown soldiers, you know, the physical ones that are actually buried in this tomb, as if we did know their identities, then they wouldn't be unknown soldiers. So I said it's bittersweet because it is kind of nice that they are commemorating unknown soldiers. You know, it is a place you can go, pay your respects to them, but it is obviously bitter in that so many soldiers end up dying, you know, way too many. And of the ones that die, way too many of them are unknown. It's bad enough them being killed, but them not being able to be buried, their family not being able to pay respects to them, that all just piles onto the heartbreak and tragedy. The Ummo Case is, well, that's a cool cover. But the Ummo Case was this case of apparent aliens, and they came from the planet Ummo. And they communicated with aliens not by talking with them, not by telepathy, but by writing letters and making phone calls. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds insane. It probably is insane. Like, why not just use Facebook messages at this point? But this whole case, this whole entry kind of has very mixed reviews. You know, if you're a believer, then you kind of wholeheartedly believe this. You believe that the information in these letters is genuinely from aliens, and it is all, you know, encoded, highly advanced, highly useful mathematics, medical stuff, space details, numbers, names, concepts. Whoa. But if you don't believe this, then a lot of this stuff is just incoherent, rambling nonsense made up by someone with clearly too much time and seemingly creativity on their hands. And this whole case and the letters, etc., do have some interesting information in that it is said does line up with some, you know, real life events. And the believers of this have said that the information is too, you know, accurate, too detailed to be a coincidence. So it must be from aliens. But it has also been labeled kind of a hoax, kind of a fraud, even by actual, you know, alien fanatics, UFO fans. And so, yeah. Let me know what you believe on this one. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Ursula Hermann was a 10-year-old girl who went missing while on her bike in Bavaria, Germany in 1981. She was, at the time, riding on her bicycle riding home, and this journey was normally like a 10-minute journey, but after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, she failed to show up, her parents alerted the police, and a search was soon started. And the police, they started the search, they went to the area that she had gone missing from, and they found more or less nothing. And that was kind of it. They didn't really have any leads to go on, they didn't have any suspicious connections, they didn't have any evidence to go off. The whole case was kind of stalled. And then 2 days later, these strange calls were made to Ursula's parents' home. You know, there was no voice on these calls, there was seemingly no person on the other end of it. There were just recordings of this piece of music from this radio ad, and then it would play, and then the phone call would just cut out. Then after 3 days, a ransom note appeared at the family home, and the note was demanding 2 million Deutschmarks, equivalent to around $3.5 million US in today's money. And then another ransom note was dropped off, and this note was demanding even more money and had instructions on how to deliver the money, but with no location for the drop-off. And then absolutely nothing. This was the last communication received from the kidnappers, and it wasn't until more than a week later, while searching the forest, that they came across a metal box in the ground, and they managed to open it. They found hooked up lights, they found blankets, food, books, a little radio, and Ursula Hermann, who had seemingly died from suffocation just a few hours after being put in the box. It seemed like the ventilation pipes that were set up to try and give Ursula air, it seemed like they were blocked off at the top due to these kind of wet leaves being stuck into them. And this maybe kind of explained why the communication had stopped from the kidnappers. You know, it seemed like they had kidnapped Ursula, put her in the box, had these ransom notes sent, and then while trying to keep Ursula alive, they had accidentally killed her by blocking off the vents. And so with no Ursula, they had nothing to bargain with, and they cut off all communications. A few people in this case were considered suspects, with one man and his wife actually being arrested for this crime, but they were later acquitted in court, meaning that this case has for the last 45 years or so remained unsolved. UVB-76, nicknamed the Buzzer, is a shortwave radio station that broadcasts a short buzz buzz sound at approximately 25 beats per minute. Buzz. Bzz. I feel like that's the dance that bees do. You know, quick, turn the radio to bee jazz. And BPM obviously stands for buzzes per minute. And this station is broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when it's not buzzing, sometimes it'll play Russian voices saying Russian things. And we have no real idea who owns the radio station or what it's used for. It is very likely something to do with Russia, with the Russian government, with probably the Russian military, but we're not super certain on that. And some people think that the buzzing is used as a deterrent to, you know, keep people off this channel. So if you or me want to use the channel for communication for some reason, you know, we're trying to talk to each other, super important, but then every few seconds you just hear buzz. It'd get super annoying super quickly. So that's one theory, that these buzzes is to stop other people being on the radio station. Another theory is that this buzzing station acts kind of like a dead man switch for Russia. So you can imagine a regular switch where you press the button to activate something. A dead man switch would be where you have to actually release the switch in order to trigger it. So if you're alive, you're holding the switch and nothing goes off. But if you were to kill that person, they would die, release the switch, and then that would trigger whatever it is. So one theory said that the constant buzzing was, you know, evidence that this Russian radio station was still around, and that if anyone bombed Russia, hit the radio station, the buzzing would stop, and then this would act as a dead man switch to launch nukes, you know, all around the world from Russia, which is a bit of a wild theory that's also kind of been disproven, because apparently the broadcast does stop buzzing every now and then, and no nukes have since been launched. There's other theories that say that the random speaking, you know, the random Russian voices aren't really anything important, but are just a way to keep, you know, Russian workers or Russian radio workers attentive to the radio station. So say you had this radio station, which they have, and I tell you, okay, sometime in the next few years maybe I'm going to release some super vital information over this radio, and you have to listen at all times because you have no idea when it's coming. But to make sure that you're actually listening, I'm going to randomly broadcast these voices, and every time I broadcast a voice, you need to be there, you need to listen, you need to write down whatever it said, and then I will come and check. So maybe it's to stop people just being like, oh, you know, nothing ever comes out of this radio station, and to stop them being lazy and not listening, which I kind of like that theory. But yeah, the broadcasts are still playing, the buzzing never stops, and it is still full of mystery. The volcanic eruption of 416 AD. So this refers to a book written in 1869 by Java poet and writer, and if there are any people from Java watching this, please comment down below how I say this name, but his name is Radin Nabahi Rangawasita. Yeah, this is probably the worst one so far, but this is a huge book documenting as best he could the entire history of Java, and he basically used a bunch of ancient texts, you know, piecing together lost storylines and forgotten events. It is really quite an epic history book, but one event referred to in the book was this giant explosion, this giant eruption of Mount Capi, which the name Capi is no longer in use, so we don't know for certain exactly what mountain it was, but people have kind of pieced together clues, pieced together evidence, and they think Capi might very well refer to Mount Krakatoa. And so these texts tell of this giant eruption of Krakatoa in the year 416 AD, even though all of the evidence that we have gathered from almost everywhere else says that Krakatoa actually erupted in 535 AD, so over 100 years later. So, I mean, did he just get the dates wrong? Or did we perhaps get the dates wrong? Or were there actually two eruptions 100 years apart? Or was he referring to actually another mountain, you know, another volcano? And it's kind of hard to say. It's a super interesting case. I will leave an incredible write-up down in the description below. But the guy who wrote it, Cherry Blossom 724, which Cool name, by the way. But he notes that after the 535 eruption, some of the evidence that we have for the 535 eruption is that the script writings and the activities, etc., diminished greatly in quantity over the next like 20 years, which means in that period of 20 years, something clearly destructive, catastrophic happened, that it affected the amount of stuff being written. Whereas in the years around 416 AD, no such decline in writings happened, meaning that either, he says, something didn't happen around then, or it was really so minor that it didn't affect things like the 535 eruption. So yeah, super fascinating entry. I absolutely love all of this ancient history type stuff, or should I say I absolutely lava it. You know, lava, eruptions, volcanoes. Oh boy, that was terrible. The Wailing of Wilga Waterhole is kind of like this ghost story of this watering hole in Australia. And there have been many accounts and tales of this watering hole, of people hearing these deathly screams coming from it. And there are some tales that say that there was this boy who had died of thirst around this watering hole, and he currently haunts the entire area. There were other tales that told of this giant massacre that happened there, and all of the dead in this area have stayed here to haunt the area, and they just screech and scream in the middle of the night or at anyone who passes by. And the watering hole is currently on private land, so it's a little hard to investigate it. You know, you'll have to trespass to do any real research. But yeah, very spooky entry. White holes. So a black hole, as you might know, is a region of space-time, or, you know, matter that is so condensed that it pulls everything around it into itself, even light. So you can imagine something like this mug. It has technically gravity, but it is so weak being only this mass. Our moon has gravity, so you can actually, you know, fly up there, land on it without flying away. Our Earth obviously has gravity. We have the moon spinning around it. And the sun, as you can imagine, has even more gravity. But what happens is as you get larger and larger, so you have our sun here with X amount of gravity, then if it becomes a sun like this big, it's even more gravity. But once you get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually the sun would actually collapse in on itself, because the pressure in the center is so great that it starts pulling in all of this matter, which makes it even more dense, which increases its gravity even more, and so it just turns into an endless loop and sucks everything in around it. And that was a great black hole impression, by the way. But the reason we call it a black hole is because it is so strong, the gravity of it, that even light, which weighs nothing, even light can't escape a black hole. So the light flies into it, and instead of, you know, bouncing off, reflecting off, or flying around it or something like that, where we can actually see the light, instead of that, the light goes towards the black hole, and then once it crosses the event horizon, it is doomed to, you know, spiral around the black hole and essentially get sucked into it. So anything past this event horizon to us appears black. But white holes are a theoretical counterpart to black holes, and they haven't been proven to exist or found in reality. But where black holes kind of suck everything in and expel nothing, white holes would expel everything and suck in nothing. So one of the theories is that a black hole actually kind of creates a wormhole, and this wormhole is, you know, maybe somewhere out in space, maybe in another dimension, maybe in another universe. I don't know. Space is insanely complicated. But the theory is that everything that flies into a black hole doesn't actually get destroyed, but just travels through the wormhole and then out the other end through this white hole. And that is basically the whole mystery. It's a very strange, mind-blowing concept. I mean, black holes are mind-blowing enough as it is. So white holes, you know, step that up a little bit. Space and physics is kind of equal parts insane, fascinating, beautiful, and also terrifying. But yeah, I'll be sure to update you guys if we ever do find actual evidence of white holes. The woman on the Road of Bones. So firstly, the Road of Bones is this road or route in Russia, named so because it was built on the bones of tens of thousands of prisoners and workers. You know, gulag prisoners who were forced to build this road back in the days of Stalin, and when they were worked to death, essentially, instead of burying them, whatever, they just threw them onto the road, built over them, and just continued. And so this was dubbed the Road or Route of Bones. Pretty dark and terrifying, but this entry refers to the case of this woman who was seen walking along the road, and she was seen walking along for months along this route to apparently the destination of Magadan, which is a massively long journey to be walking along. And apparently when people came, they stopped by the side of the road to ask for help, or to ask her if she needed help. They offered her food, they offered her water, they offered her clothes, or to, give her a ride, or to give her warmth. And every single time, she just refused everything. Nobody knows who she was, where she came from, where she went, if she actually made the journey, or if she died along the way, or if she wasn't actually a person, because some of the theories say that she may have been a ghost of some kind, or a spirit, either of some woman who had died along the route, or saying she was the wife of a man who had died, and she was basically forever haunting this route. The Zanfretta aliens. So this is a case that I covered in my Ultimate Alien Iceberg, so check it out if you like that sort of thing. But this happened in Italy in 1978. And this happened when a night watchman named Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was guarding a villa at night when he suddenly saw a round red object just there. So he radioed his supervisor, who later attested that he heard Zanfretta screaming, on the other end of the radio. And when he went round there, Zanfretta was just collapsed on the floor. They woke him up and he said he saw what he described as these 3 large aliens. Or actually, an important detail is he didn't say aliens, he said creatures. But he said they had like rumpled or fat skin, triangular eyes, and clawed feet. And when Zanfretta was asked if he was attacked by these men, Zanfretta said, "No, these were not men." Zanfretta then went on to be actually abducted multiple times over the next few years by these same apparent creatures, and under hypnosis started to reveal more and more about these abductions, about these encounters, about these creatures. Their mouths, he said, looked like they were made out of metal. They had these strange red veins on their heads. They had pointy ears, and they came from the 3rd galaxy, whatever that means. I don't even know where the 2nd galaxy is. So a bit of a strange encounter, but quite an interesting alien case, which, as I said before, if you like aliens, UFOs, all that sort of thing, absolutely check out the Alien and UFO Iceberg. Link in the description below. Oakey Kite is a case that we've already covered, and this was under the case of Robert Cooper, and it's basically exactly the same case. Robert Cooper was just the suspected culprit, Oakey Kite was the victim, but we'll briefly go over it again here. And Oakey Kite was this 53-year-old employee of this engineering firm, or engineering consulting firm technically, in Colorado, and he went missing in 2004. Now, when he went missing, he didn't turn up for work. His work and his family started to get a little bit concerned, so his family called the police, a search was started, and he was found there, tied up, beaten, tortured, and just left there. His phone and wallet weren't found anywhere. His ATM card was actually used a little later by this man, who was clearly wearing a ski mask and driving Oakey's truck. And this is really where the big mystery was. Firstly, who killed Oakey and why? Secondly, who was this mysterious man driving this truck, using Oakey's bank card to withdraw money? Are these two the same men? Did Ski Mask Man kill Oakey? And if they aren't the same man, that means there's multiple people involved, and I think that just adds even more to the mystery. And Oakey himself was a very kind of down-to-earth, reasonable guy. He wasn't shady or dodgy or violent or aggressive. He didn't seem to have any enemies, especially enemies this extreme that would, kidnap, lock someone up, torture them, and then kill them. But this Ski Mask Man, he is thought to be the same man who rented a room from Oakey, as according to witnesses, the man who rented this room was kind of quiet, kind of mysterious. He would always, he'd be talking to Oakey face to face. Someone else would come into the house, come into the room, and he would always be like, kind of try and hide his face, try and make his identity as vague as possible without rousing too much suspicion. And so they looked into this man who had rented the room from Oakey, and they found that all of his information that he gave to Oakey was basically false. His address was false, it was made up. His name that he gave, Robert Cooper, was also made up. And so that's basically where the case ended. There are theories that say that this man, the Robert Cooper, was connected in some ways to the Turkish Hezbollah, just because some of the DNA found at the scene was linked not to an individual person, but to a kind of group of people, in the Balkan kind of East area. You know, you could argue it was vaguely Turkish. And some of the torture and killing techniques that were used on Oakey have been known to be used by Turkish Hezbollah. So that's kind of the conclusion they came to, but they weren't really able to press the case or investigate it much further than that. Flight 980. So this was a flight in 1985 that was going from Paraguay to Miami. And while descending for its scheduled stopover in Bolivia, for some unknown reason, it crashed into the side of Mount Illimani 6,000 meters up, killing everyone on board. And this entire case, the entire investigation, just got weirder and weirder the more they investigated it. Firstly, the site where they crashed, Mount Illimani, wasn't on their scheduled route, and in all the communications they had had with the airplane, they never once mentioned being, you know, in trouble or being lost or changing their route for whatever reason. So that was a little strange. And just after this crash, there were efforts made to go up to the crash, to investigate, to maybe retrieve things from the flight, maybe fuselage, maybe any evidence, maybe even the black box, which, for those who don't know, the black box of a plane is basically this little, basically indestructible box. You know, it can survive in all sorts of conditions, and it records both the cockpit communications, you know, what the pilots were talking about, etc., as well as all of the flight inputs. So it'll show, you know, if the pilot pulled back or turned this on or turned this off or whatever. So it's absolutely essential to, you know, recover these if you're investigating what happened on the plane. So because the flight was so high up, or the crash was so high up, there was trouble initially getting a group to actually go up there and investigate. The local government was kind of less than useful, we can say, in this. And so it actually took some American, you know, investigation, some American pressure to organize a group of local hikers, you know, very experienced mountaineers, and they went up there. They found this actual wreckage, but strangely, they said they found no bodies, no blood, no black box even, but they did find pieces of the plane, and strangely, they found what was described as millions of dollars worth of illegal smuggled goods. And one of these goods was these smuggled reptile skins. And then when they came down, they basically, you know, told everyone what they found, and they said in their expert opinion that this entire area was far too dangerous for anyone to go up and investigate in, at least until the dry season, so a few months after this. And we'll get into the statement just a little bit later, but fast forward to later on in the year, and Bolivia released a accident report, you know, of this crash, of this incident, and strangely enough, in the report, they determined that the crash site was basically fully inaccessible, you know, even though these local climbers had originally gone up there. And in the report, they also made no mention of all of the illegal smuggled goods. And it seemed very much like they were trying to, for some reason, sweep something under the rug. They concluded that this was a controlled flight into the mountains, but had no real further explanation about what the pilots were doing, why they made this mistake, etc. And interestingly enough, as I said in the report, the area was said or deemed to be inaccessible, even though a single man named Ramon Valdez, he went up there. You know, he actually managed to make the hike, make the climb. He had obviously a bunch of local helpers, but this kind of proved that the site was far from inaccessible. You know, if a single man could do it, then surely some crew, some government-funded crew would be able to get up there and investigate. But as I said, he managed to actually get up there. He dug around a bit. He took some photographs. He took some videos. And so it seems strange that the Bolivian government wouldn't want to go up there. The airline that this flight belonged to, Eastern Airlines, was often implicated in these smuggling operations, you know, from various places in South America into especially Miami, with their planes and employees being implicated in these as well. And obviously a lot of these smuggled items could range from stuff like devil's snow, you know, or substances of that kind, to what the initial hikers found, that being illegal reptile skins, which might add more kind of context. It might make sense why the Bolivian government was kind of trying to cover this up, as a bunch of South American countries were kind of implicated in stuff like this. So maybe Bolivia didn't want this kind of pinned on them, you know. And if you are the cartel or whoever was smuggling these into Miami, it wouldn't really be that hard to go to some of these higher ups in Bolivia, you know, bribe them with a few $1,000s and say, look, just just brush this investigation under the rug. We don't want too many cameras here. We don't want too much detail here. And so I think that is a very good theory as to what might have happened with this. And also, as I mentioned before, when one of the original hikers came down from the mountain, he said that in his professional opinion, no one else should attempt this climb until the dry season. But we later found out that he was actually told to say this by someone in the Bolivian government, even though he later came forward and said in his opinion, you know, it would have been fine to climb it. I mean, he climbed it. It seems like the Bolivian government was trying to cover it up, but as to why the flight actually crashed, we still really have no idea. There were earlier reports of this wreckage falling from the sky, which was a fair distance really from where the plane crashed, which that is for the most part unexplained. Some theories say that the plane was flying along, it was shot at either with bullets or a missile or something, which blew part of the plane off, which, you know, might explain the wreckage that fell down over here. And then, since it wasn't a completely destructive injury on the plane, maybe it just continued to fly and fly and fly along until it eventually, you know, tried to steer itself and maybe crashed into the side of this mountain. Or some theories say that this wasn't intentionally brought down, that it was simply a navigational error. You know, they confused the kind of snow for the clouds for the sky and then just ended up, for whatever reason, crashing into it. And so yeah, it is a crazy case. You know, you could probably make a film out of this. It's got explosions, bribery, threats, secret government cover-ups, strange mysteries, strange characters, and all round just a very strange and mysterious case. And that is all we have time for. This video, which it's been a long time coming, marks the end of tier 8 of this iceberg. We will be starting up tier 9 in just a little while, and I think we have 3 tiers left for the longest iceberg in the world, apparently. So stay tuned for that. Stay sane, or I mean, you can be a little insane as well. That is acceptable. But get plenty of sleep, stay hydrated, and most importantly, thanks for watching.